Welcome to Roast and Reckoning, where silence ends and truth begins. My name is Chloe, and I am 31 years old. Most people move through life believing that volume equates to value. They operate under the delusion that the person speaking the loudest at the dinner table is the one holding the most power. They assume that success must be televised, or at least posted on a family group chat, to be deemed legitimate. This is the philosophy of the loud entitled, those who treat the world as their personal gift shop and their family as a bottomless credit line. They view every room as a stage and every relative as a prop in their poorly scripted melodrama. Then there are people like me. We are the architects of the quiet success. We don't speak because we are busy watching. We don't brag because we are busy building. In my world, power isn't a handshake, a plaque, or a rowdy toast. Power is the paper trail that nobody sees until the moment it becomes a noose. I have spent a decade learning that wealth is not a noise, it is a structural integrity. It is an algorithm, much like the ones I used to write in the windowless labs of Whitaker Hall, where the fluorescent lights hummed in a rhythm I memorized like a heartbeat. I think about the physics of favoritism. In most families, there is a dampening function. It's an unspoken rule that redistributes the load of disappointment and expectation. In my family, that function was broken. The load was always mine to carry, while the momentum was always gifted to my sister. My parents, Richard and Diane, never understood the value of what was built in the dark. To them, my silence was a sign of mediocrity, a lack of business mind, as if the ability to stay quiet while accumulating assets was a character flaw rather than a tactical advantage. Richard, a retired mechanical engineer, ran our household like a production floor, budgets, timelines, and a final say that was as rigid as a steel beam. He valued results, but only when they came from his star. My younger sister Sienna Diane, who kept our garden immaculate and her pride even more carefully manicured, loved both her children, but she loved one of them much louder. They measured worth by the height of the pedestal, and for 31 years, that pedestal was reserved exclusively for Sienna. They didn't realize that while they were busy building a shrine to a golden child made of glass, I was quietly buying the land beneath their feet. I've learned that the most expensive thing you can give a person is a second chance they didn't earn. You think you're being kind, but you're really just financing their next betrayal. For years, I allowed my family to believe they were the ones in control. I let them believe they were the masters of their domain, the owners of their lives, and the guardians of my future. I maintained a sophisticated silence because I knew that when the truth finally arrived, it wouldn't just be a revelation, it would be a clinical repossession. There is a certain coldness in code, and there is an even deeper coldness in a ledger. 2 + 2 is always 4, nobody can charm it into 5. While my family spent years looking at me and seeing a useless assistant, I was looking at them and seeing 47 entries in a cloud access history. 47 times they tried to bypass the security of my life to see what they could take. They didn't understand that the third loop of this family's history had a fail-safe. This is a story about the architecture of favoritism and the high cost of a golden child. It is a story about how my parents decided to gift a $5.2 million estate they didn't own to a daughter who didn't deserve it, funded by bonuses they thought they had inherited, but which were actually the dividends of my own intellectual property. It is the story of how I finally, with lethal precision, took it all back. The childhood home I grew up in was a museum dedicated to the potential of one person. If you walked down the main hallway, the walls were a visual liturgy of Sienna. There was Sienna's first-grade finger painting, framed in gilded wood as if it were a Picasso. There was her cheerleading photo, her prom queen tiara in a velvet-lined shadow box, and her most improved ribbons from middle school, polished as if they were Olympic gold. The air in that house always smelled of lemon pine cleaner, and a desperate, cloying praise that felt like breathing in sugar. My father, Richard, would sit at the head of the table and recount Sienna's mediocre social triumphs, a new partnership at a boutique firm, an invitation to a country club, as if they were tactical military victories. I existed in the periphery. My one photo was tucked near the coat closet, a 9th grade science fair ribbon for a neural network classifier I built from scratch. I was holding the ribbon like I didn't quite believe it. Nobody in my family understood the project. Nobody asked. While Sienna, now 28, spent her time as a socialite, treating the city like her personal playground and viewing every relationship as a transaction. I was entering the world of high-end estate management and distressed asset acquisition. I learned early on that information is the only currency that doesn't depreciate. While Sienna was maxing out credit cards my parents couldn't afford to pay off, I was amassing a portfolio. I worked 16-hour days, mastering the intricacies of LLCs, holding companies, and leaseback agreements. I built a fortune that was entirely invisible to the people who shared my DNA. To them, I was just Chloe, the daughter who worked a boring office job and never had anything interesting to say at Sunday dinner. 3 years ago, the Adams financial house of cards began to collapse. Richard's investments in a series of failed mechanical patents had drained their liquid assets. They were months away from losing the $5.2 million estate they had spent their lives using to impress the neighbors. The house was a masterpiece of Carrara marble, triple-paned floor-to-ceiling Shuko glass, and sprawling Japanese Zen gardens designed by a disciple of Osamu Noguchi. It was a physical manifestation of their ego. I didn't let them lose it. But I didn't give them the money either. Through a series of shielded LLCs under the banner of CA Holdings, I purchased the estate myself. I became their landlord without them ever knowing my name was on the deed. I structured it as a professional leaseback agreement, a distressed asset acquisition that allowed them to stay in their home for a fraction of its market value. To them, I was a nameless, faceless corporate entity that Richard complained about every Sunday. The landlord is raising the insurance requirements again, Richard spat during one particularly dry roast dinner, gesturing toward the vaulted ceiling. Typical corporate greed. They don't respect that this is a family home. They treat us like mere tenants. I sat across from him, sipping my water, and watched the way the candlelight caught the edge of the Calacatta Borghini marble countertop. My countertop. It's a business, Dad, I said quietly. They probably just want to protect their asset. Diane sighed, patting Richard's hand. They have no soul, Chloe. Not like us. They don't understand the legacy of this house. I stayed silent. I let them live in the delusion of ownership. I let them believe they were the masters of a domain that was technically my tax write-off. I was the silent observer of my own property, waiting for the moment their entitlement would finally exceed their reach. The event of the decade was sparked by the arrival of Julian. Julian came from a family of old money, the kind of people who value paper, pedigree, and provenance above all else. They are people who don't just own things, they own history. When Sienna announced her engagement to him, my parents reacted as if they had been knighted. Julian's family, however, was discerning. They looked at my parents and saw people who were comfortable, but they needed to see the kind of generational stability that only a $5 million deed provides. My parents became obsessed with keeping up appearances. They were terrified that Julian's family would see through the thin veneer of their finances. In their desperation to secure Sienna's royal match, they reached a consensus. I was called to a private meeting in Richard's study, a room filled with leather-bound books he had never read and a collection of vintage compasses he didn't know how to use. Chloe, my mother started, her voice hushed and manipulative, smelling of that cloying magnolia perfume. You know how important this wedding is for Sienna. Julian's family, they expect a certain level of contribution. We've decided, Richard said, leaning back with an air of unearned authority, that we are gifting the estate to Sienna and Julian as a wedding present. It will be the foundation of their new life together. A legacy. I felt a cold, sharp sensation in my chest. It wasn't hurt, it was the dampening function of my own patience finally failing. You're gifting them the house? I asked. You have so much, Chloe, Diane said, her voice dripping with the gaslighting that had defined my 20s. You're so independent. You don't need the security that Sienna does. She needs the pedigree this house provides. I watched them. I watched two people try to give away something they didn't own. They had been looking at 47 logs of my work, thinking they could just rename the variables and call the code theirs. I said, my voice as level as a horizon line. And when were you planning on announcing this? At the engagement gala, Richard beamed. In front of everyone. It's going to be the crowning moment of the evening. I nodded. I didn't argue. I didn't point out the legal impossibility of their plan. I simply decided to wait. I would let them have their stage, but I would provide the final act the night of the gala arrived. The estate had been transformed into a perfumed vacuum of elite vanity. The air was thick with the scent of 5,000 Casablanca lilies, their heavy, white petals exuding an aroma so dense it was almost suffocating. The clinking of baccarat crystal echoed against the Carrara marble floors like the sound of breaking ice. The architecture of the house, usually so clean and modern with its stucco glass and minimalist lines, was now draped in the excess of new money trying to look old. Garlands of white roses snaked up the glass staircase, and the outdoor Zen garden was lit by 1,000 flickering lanterns, reflecting off the black koi pond like fallen stars. The city's most influential people, the mayors, the tech moguls, the legacy heirs, moved through the rooms like colorful fish in a very expensive, very pressurized tank. I wore a dress that was a statement of absolute ownership, a custom midnight blue silk gown, perfectly tailored to a razor's edge. It was the kind of garment that screamed proprietor to those who knew how to read the cut of a silhouette, while remaining invisible to those who only look for labels. My family, however, treated me like an underpaid assistant. Chloe, make sure the caterers are refilling the 2012 Dom Perignon, Diane whispered as she floated past me, her diamonds catching the light of the $40,000 Italian chandelier. She didn't look at my face, she looked at the tray in the distance. Chloe, go find the event coordinator. The string quartet is playing the Vivaldi too fast, Sienna barked from the top of the marble staircase. She was wearing a dress that cost more than a mid-sized sedan, financed by a credit line I knew was at its limit. I moved through my own house, watching the wealthy guests admire the Calicata marble I had personally selected from a quarry in Tuscany. I felt the vibration of the music in the floorboards, the reinforced oak I had paid to install after the 2021 foundation shift. The atmosphere was one of triumphant entitlement. Julian's parents, the Whitakers, stood in the center of the foyer, their expressions a mask of aristocratic boredom. They were the target of this performance. They were here to see if the Addams family was worthy of their old money bloodline. I watched Richard hold court near the floor-to-ceiling glass walls. He was pointing out the legacy of the gardens as if he had planted every stone himself. He looked relaxed, loose, the kind of loose that comes from believing you're untouchable. He was drinking his good bourbon, the 25-year-old Pappy Van Winkle he'd found in the pantry, unaware that I had replaced the bottle he thought he owned with a bottle I had bought for the house's inventory. The wealth porn was everywhere. The catering staff served beluga caviar on mother-of-pearl spoons. The air conditioning was tuned to a crisp 68 degrees to offset the heat of 300 bodies in silk and wool. The guest list was a who's who of the regional elite, all of them here to witness the transfer of a $5.2 million asset. I checked my watch. 9 p.m. The folder in my hand, silver, brushed steel, weighing exactly 1.4 pounds, contained the dampening function for the evening. It was a collection of documents, the original deed from CA Holdings, the 3 years of lease agreement signed by Richard in his shaky, mechanical engineer scrawl, and the 47 entries of the cloud access history where they had tried to access the LLC's banking portals. I felt the weight of the paper. It felt like an executioner's axe. The sensory immersion was complete. The lilies, the crystal, the smell of expensive cologne, and the cold, hard reality of the law. I was the ghost at the feast, and it was time for the haunting to begin. The music faded. The string quartet lowered their bows. Richard stood at the head of the grand table, his glass of vintage Bordeaux raised. The silence that fell over the room was expectant, hungry for the spectacle. Richard, voice booming, full of unearned authority, friends, family, and distinguished guests. Today, we celebrate more than a union of hearts. We celebrate the union of legacies. To my daughter Sienna, and her fiancé Julian, you represent the future we always envisioned. Sienna beams, dabbing a theatrical tear from her eye. Julian's father nods with stiff approval. Richard, CONT'd, a future requires a foundation. And so, Diane and I have decided that there is no better gift than the home you stand in today. It is our honor to announce that we are gifting this $5.2 million estate, our family home, to Sienna and Julian. May it be the seat of your dynasty for generations. The room erupts in applause. Sienna clings to Julian. The Whitakers lean in to offer their congratulations. Chloe steps forward, her heels clicking rhythmically against the marble. Chloe, if I could just add a few words to that beautiful sentiment. The crowd turns. Richard smiles, a patronizing, "Isn't that sweet?" look on his face. Chloe, conted, "Thank you, Dad, that was a magnificent speech." The idea of gifting a legacy is powerful. But as an expert in estate management, I noticed a small, technical detail that we should probably clarify before the champagne is finished. Chloe opens the silver folder. She pulls out a document and slides it across the table toward Julian's father. Chloe, conted, "You see, Dad, for a gift to be valid, the donor must actually own the asset. To the room, this property is held by an LLC, CA Holdings. I am the sole director and owner of that entity. I purchased this estate 3 years ago when the family legacy was facing a public auction due to Richard's mechanical failures in the market." The silence is now a vacuum. Richard's face turns the exact shade of the dying lilies. Chloe, conted, "My parents are not owners. They are my tenants. They have been living here under a triple net lease for 36 months. She turns to Richard, "And while I appreciate the spirit of your gift, Dad, you cannot give away my $5.2 million asset to Sienna. You don't own the chair you're sitting in." "I do. In fact, if you check the metadata on the trust dividends you used to pay for this gala, you'll find they were falsified bonuses redirected from my personal intellectual property." Julian's father, picking up the document, his voice like dry parchment, "Richard? Is this a lease agreement?" Richard, stammering, the star fading, It's a family arrangement." "Chloe, how could you do this here?" Chloe, with lethal precision, "I'm just following the code, Dad. 2 + 2 is 4. You tried to gift what you stole, and I'm simply repossessing what's mine. This isn't an engagement gift. It's an eviction notice." The fallout was clinical. The Whitakers didn't shout, "Old money doesn't scream." They simply withdrew. They stood up, their faces like stone, and signaled for their coats. To them, my parents weren't just poor, they were fraudsters. They were new money pretending to be no money, and in the elite circles of this city, that is a social death sentence. Sienna's royal match evaporated in the time it took to call a valet. Julian looked at her not with love, but with the disgust one reserves for a counterfeit watch. He was gone before the first guest reached the driveway. My parents tried to reclaim the narrative. Richard started to shout about betrayal, his voice echoing through the Schuco glass and Carrara marble. "Richard," I said, using his name for the first time in my life. "Stop. If you continue this performance, I will move from landlord to litigator. Your lease is in default for attempted fraudulent transfer of an asset. You have 30 days to find a home you actually own. The house is quiet now. The 5,000 lilies have wilted, their scent turning from sweet to sour. The elite guests have scrubbed our names from their social calendars, and the estate is empty, echoing with the silence of a structure that finally belongs to its rightful owner. There is an emotional justice in finally being seen. My family sees me now. They don't see me as Chloe, the invisible one, or the science fair kid near the coat closet. They see me as the person who holds the receipts. They see me through the lens of their own ruin, which is the only way they were ever capable of looking at the truth. Inheritance isn't something you're given, it's something you earn through the silence of your work and the strength of your boundaries. My parents spent their lives financing a golden child with money they didn't have and a legacy they didn't build. They learned the hard way that the most dangerous person at the table is the one who doesn't need to speak to be heard. I look at the 47 logs of their attempts to enter my world. I look at the code of my life, clean and self-correcting. Silence is the ultimate weapon. Because while they were talking, I was signing. If you've ever been the invisible child who held the receipts, tell your story in the comments. Subscribe for more reckonings. I'll see you in the next one.